Hello and welcome. Welcome to the Center for European Studies annual Distinguished Lecture. My name is Joshua Cole. I'm the director of the Center for European Studies at the University of Michigan, and I'm very, very pleased to see all of you here today. This lecture is part of the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts theme semester on race, a series of events that are taking place throughout the rest of the year. And because of this co-sponsorship, I'd like to say a few words before I introduce our speaker today. The question of how societies deal with the fact of human diversity is a very old question. In many ways, the problem of human difference is the fundamental question for governance. Every political system must begin with a distinction between the ruler and the ruled. Political systems that are based on a notion of egalitarian citizenship, such as our own, have historically confronted the problem of human diversity in deciding who gets to belong to this collective group of citizens. And this question is one of both internal and external borders. Who is inside and who is outside this charmed circle that defines the sovereign body of the nation? Now, answers to this question can change. When the United States was founded, women couldn't vote, and neither could slaves. Slaves did count as 3/5 of a person when it came to apportioning representation in Congress. The power of southern slaveholding states in the House of Representatives was thus increased at the federal level at the moment of the United States founding by counting people who were unable to vote, denied basic civil rights, and who remained subject to a brutal system of exploitation and violence. Fortunately, we no longer do things this way. But recent debates about the role played by demography, this is a code word, I think, the role played by demography in the 2012 US presidential election indicate that the question of race and politics has not gone away. Likewise, the question of human difference is also the, or maybe a, but maybe the, fundamental question of social science. Every attempt to describe a given social order must necessarily organize itself in terms of categories. And because the mental categories that we use to organize our knowledge of society are often assumed to be a reflection of true and natural distinctions that have an independent existence in the world, much confusion ensues. Race is just such a category. It was once, in the 19th century and much of the 20th, treated as if it was a biological fact. This is now largely repudiated by biologists who have a much more complicated picture of the relationship between physical appearance, genetic makeup, and social behaviors or cultural practices. But even though biology is no longer available to prop up our definitions of racial groups, people still use the categories as if they mean something. And in some important and confusing ways, they do continue to mean something. Discrimination exists. In many parts of the United States today, young black men are more likely to go to prison than to graduate from college. This nearly 2 generations after the Civil Rights Act put an end to official segregation in the United States. Pointing out that race is a socially constructed category doesn't really help solve this problem in the short term, though it might be a start. One of the important functions of a theme semester on race is to pause and reflect on the state of this confusion and the historical reasons that have brought us to this point, and perhaps some possibly constructive ways out of the bitter debates that still surround and divide people around this subject. We are especially fortunate, therefore, to have Didier Fassin here today to help us understand at least part of this problem. Professor Fassin has had many parallel and distinguished careers. In fact, sitting down and trying to write an introduction to him was, I've never quite been challenged in this way in introducing speakers at this center. Let me just start by telling a little bit of the story. He was first a medical doctor. He was trained as a physician. He practiced internal medicine in France, in India, and in Tunisia. Simultaneously, however, he also became a social scientist, getting his doctorate in sociology and anthropology. And while he was doing that, he was doing field work in Ecuador and in Senegal. For 7 years later in his career, mostly in this most recent past decade, he conducted fieldwork in post-apartheid South Africa on the world's worst public health crisis, that is, the AIDS epidemic, exploring the effects of the disease on communities in Soweto and Alexandra. And in this work, he placed stories of AIDS patients and their lives against the background of segregation, discrimination, and exploitation. This work resulted in a remarkable book, When Bodies Remember: Experiences and the Politics of AIDS in South Africa. This was published in 2007. More recently, his 2009 book, The Empire of Trauma, an inquiry into the condition of victimhood, co-written with Richard Rechtman, won the 2010 William A. Douglas Prize for Best Book in Europeanist Anthropology from the American Anthropological Association. This book studied the psychiatric treatment of victims of the 1995 terrorist bombings in Paris and the 2001 industrial disaster in Toulouse, and the use also of humanitarian psychology with both Palestinians and Israelis during the Second Intifada. He argues in this book that a new psychological discourse on trauma has developed in recent years, seeking to authenticate and invalidate in a new way the experience of suffering in the modern world, validate in such a way as to make suffering unassailable from a moral perspective. I won't go into the at least a half a dozen other books that he has written. I will just simply mention that in the past decade, Didier Fassin has found time to be the vice president of Doctors Without Borders and director of studies at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, the School of Advanced Studies in Social Sciences. Since 2009, he has been the James D. Wolfenson Professor of Social Science at the Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton. His current work is on the anthropology of the state, exploring the political and moral treatment of disadvantaged people, including immigrants and refugees, through an ethnography of police, justice, and the prison. We are extremely fortunate to have him here today. Please join me in welcoming Didier Fassin.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be at the University of Michigan, and it's an honor to deliver this annual lecture. I thank Joshua Cole for his invitation and the Center for European Studies. I took very seriously, as you will see, his injunction to speak about race and Europe, and came up with this theme, which I prepared especially for this event, and I therefore look forward to your comments and critique. Just have to understand how. Actually, it is often asserted that, at least in literature, constraint generates creativity. In France, the birth of Renaissance poetry was associated with the formal frame of the sonnet, a 14-verse poem with strictly defined rhymes, adopted by Joachim du Bellay and Pierre de Ronsard. And the development of the classical tragedy is inconceivable without the imposition of the Alexandrine, a 12-syllable line of poetic meter systematically used by Pierre Corneille and Jean Racine. Constraint even became the foundational principle of the literary group Oulipo, Ouvroir de littérature potentielle, meaning workshop of potential literature, in the 1960s with Raymond Queneau and Italo Calvino, among other writers and mathematicians, members of the group. The most famous achievement is the 300-page novel La Disparition by Georges Perec, written without the letter E, hence the title The Disappearance, as the whole mystery is about the disappeared letter. followed later by les revenantes, this time only using the vowel E. It is a much easier constraint you provided for this lecture, since you asked me to speak about Europe, which is the geographical area of interest of your center, and to inscribe my talk in the university-wide theme of this semester, that is race. The constraint here is not so much to cross the area and the theme as to discourse during 1 hour on a theme that is precisely not one in that area. Race, which is so commonly debated in the United States, is a difficult topic in Europe and even an unpronounceable term in France. I could certainly have addressed the issue of the repression of the notion, but it would have implied that race is a reality that Europeans in general and French in particular are containing in their collective unconscious. And of course, no one would assert that races exist as such and that it is their reality that is repressed. What does exist, however, is the common belief that some individuals or groups should be treated differently because of their physical features, skin color, origin, and this is what we call racial discrimination. It does not imply the objective existence of race as a biological fact, as we've seen, but its subjective persistence in social life. In the United States, racial discrimination is regarded as a historical phenomenon which is almost consubstantial with the fabric of the nation. It has been routinely practiced, aggressively legalized, fervently combated. Slavery, the Civil War, the Jim Crow laws, the Civil Rights Movement, Brown versus Board of Education are landmarks of the national narrative. In Europe, by contrast, it has been generally considered as a pathological deviance of the modern times, culminating with the Nazi regime, or as an accidental process resulting from the colonial saga and thus circumscribed in the margins of the empires. On a mostly white continent, it could be viewed as both contingent and peripheral. Admittedly, racism existed, but it was a psychological perversion. There was rarely the idea that of racial discrimination as a structural fact involving the entirety of society. France is a quintessential illustration of this avoidance. It is not until the late 1990s that the expression and the facts it designates started to be acknowledged in the public sphere and the political realm. And even then, racial discrimination soon became euphemized. The issue I want to address is therefore that of the denial of racial discrimination in Europe, and more specifically in France. The British criminologist Stanley Cohen, who died a month ago, wrote that the question of denial, to which he devoted his last book, had haunted his thoughts all his life, from his childhood in South Africa to his move to Israel, and I share his concern about the importance of apprehending its ubiquity and ambiguity. I will demonstrate that denial is a too vague word and will propose to distinguish analytically at least two forms of denial. But if denial is my object, I hope I can show that a reflection on it can also enlighten the understanding of racial discrimination. And if Europe is my terrain, I hope my conclusions can also help to recognize forms of denial in the United States as well. I will begin with a brief historical overview of what may be called the French discovery of racial discrimination, then offer a sociological interpretation of its denial using a psychoanalytical language, later discuss the specific but important case of the denial of racial discrimination in law enforcement, and finally make a few suggestions on what denial can teach us about how to approach racial discrimination in policing and beyond. My reflection on this topic draws on 10 years of research, First, studying the policies against racial discrimination in France, and second, doing an ethnography of the policing of the housing project outside of Paris after the 2005 riots. But it is also shaped by my experience as a member of the first national institution dedicated to these issues, the Group for the Study of and Fight Against Discrimination, and as an intellectual implicated in public debates and law cases against racial profiling in the practice of stop and frisk. On such topics, it is certainly not uncommon and potentially quite heuristic to combine what Norbert Elias distinguished as involvement and detachment. Until the late 1990s, one did not speak of racial discrimination in France. In a systematic survey I did on the use of the expression in the French newspaper Le Monde since 1980, I observed that until 1998, the occurrence of the locution racial discrimination was relatively rare and referred almost exclusively to South Africa and the United States. The reality designated seemed to be foreign to France and more broadly to Europe. Certainly, racism was acknowledged, but essentially as a collective prejudice and as individual acts, in particular racist crimes, which had been particularly frequent against Arabs during the decades following the Algerian War of Independence, 200 assassinations having been tallied in the 1970s and 1980s in the relative indifference of political parties and the public opinion. The famous March for Equality and Against Racism in 1983 from Marseille to Paris, incorrectly renamed Marche des Beurs, was initiated after the aggression of a young Arab activist by the police and fueled by the killing of an Algerian tourist thrown out of the window of a train by 3 far-right young legionnaires. But in spite of the common experience of unfavorable treatment of immigrants and their children on the housing and job markets, as well as by administration and enterprises, racial discrimination was never discussed and was even dismissed. Significantly, in the first report of the High Council for Integration in 1992, the authors, noticing differences of salaries between nationals and foreigners, it is legally impossible to analyze this sort of differences between ethnic or racial groups in France. So, noticing these differences of salaries, affirmed that, quote, they should not be taken too rapidly as synonymous of discrimination, unquote. They argued that these differences were due to the fact that the employers prefer nationals for their better so-called human capital, and would certainly these differences would certainly disappear once the foreign employees would give evidence of their merits. The differences of salaries were thus not regarded as unjust and not interpreted as discriminatory. Their correction did not involve a change in the practices of the employers, but of the employees. More generally, disparities in employment, housing, education, health never led to questioning the French society. And when they were recognized, they were not even attributed to the origin, using nationality as a proxy for racial or ethnic identification, but they were recalculated to demonstrate that all things being equal, they were the consequence of socioeconomic inequality. Race was subsumed under class, a reformulation that satisfied the critical thinkers and left-wing parties. In other words, discrepancies in employment rates or educational achievements were due to socioeconomic inequalities, which were themselves the result of an insufficient integration. Discrimination was unthinkable, and its racial dimension was immeasurable. This dominant conception started to change in 1998 when the same High Council for Integration published a report titled Fighting Against Discrimination. By naming the problem, the authors reversed the causality in the interpretation of the observed differences. It was no more the fault of the workers, or more broadly, of the concerned population, but the responsibility of the employers and more generally of the French society. Besides, the institution admitted for the first time that nationality was not sufficient to assess discrimination since, quote, it could also affect French persons of color from the Caribbean or from of non-European descent, unquote. Although it is an important indicator considering its official character, this report was, however, more a symptom than the source of the sudden recognition of racial discrimination that occurred during this period in France. The transformation of the public sphere in that respect had three major causes. Firstly, the European Union had engaged an important program of naming, measuring, and combating racial discrimination, which was ultimately formulated in the Racial Equality Directive. This major act, quote, implemented the principle of equal treatment between persons irrespective of racial or ethnic origins, providing conceptual tools such as indirect discrimination and juridical instruments, in particular the share of the burden of proof between the complainant and the respondent, to address the issue. France could not remain the dirty man of Europe by systematically avoiding the subject in its discourse, its statistics, and its policies. Secondly, within the country, a mobilization of non-governmental organizations which strikingly established the existence of discrimination in discotheques, for example, and of social scientists whose studies revealed its banality in the enterprises, including among unions, had played a substantial role in publicizing the issue. Several of them ended up joining the group for the study of and fight against discrimination created in 1999. And thirdly, and more structurally, the demography of the problem had progressively evolved, making discrimination less acceptable by its victims and its racial character more obvious than it was the case before. Indeed, from the 1960s to the 1990s, inequality of treatment affected mostly immigrants, who were generally foreigners, as they had previously affected colonial subjects. They were not given the same rights as the national, and most of the time had themselves internalized their illegitimacy. The principal claim of the March for Equality and Against Racism was significantly to simply obtain a 10-year residence permit to gain some recognition, even as aliens. Contrarily, by the 1990s, as the same unfavorable situation was experienced this time, children of these immigrants were mostly French and born in France. It could no more be justified on any juridical ground, and it became obvious that this discrimination was racial. When a helpline with a toll-free number was made available for victims and witnesses of racial discrimination, those who called to file a complaint often said they were doing it to compensate the silence of their parents who had suffered from even worse condition. The emergence of racial discrimination as a social problem was thus the predictable consequence of this conjunction of three very distinct factors. Ignored until the late 1990s, racial discrimination became within a few years a commonplace of the political discourse and of public action. In fact, only the word discrimination was generally used without the adjective to qualify it, since it was often asserted that to refer to discrimination as racial would give credit to the existence of races. The official expression was the circumlocution, discrimination due to the real or supposed origin. Beyond this linguistic prudence, a series of substantial institutional innovations were introduced by the socialist government after 1999, with the creation of the national entity that I already mentioned, as well as local equivalents in each department, the vote of a legislation much more favorable to the victims, the development of statistical surveys and research programs, the convening of all sectors of societies, including employers and unions, and the training of labor inspectors on the issue. Yet it soon appeared that, in practice, the changes were much more limited on the ground due to the reluctance of the local agents to implement it. And after the accession to power of a right-wing government in 2002, a swing of the pendulum was even observed, often taking subtle forms. The locution "fight against discrimination" disappeared from the official discourse and was replaced by "promotion of equal opportunity." Presented as a more positive reformulation of the same goal, it had the effect of avoiding the juridical dimension of the sanction and replacing it by a mere incitation to improve diversity, an orientation that was clearly intended to reassure the employers. Simultaneously, the racial dimension of the problem was progressively erased as the inequality of treatment aimed at by the policies concerned also age, handicap, gender, sexual orientation, and union membership. Justified on logical grounds, this conflation of all the sources of discrimination had for result to erase the historical specificity and the political signification of racial discrimination in light of colonization and post-colonial immigration, as well as from the perspective of the articulation of race and class. This evolution translated into new discourses, both at a national and a local level. Bernard Stasi, former minister in charge of foreshadowing the future high authority against discrimination and for equality, asserted in an interview, quote, "A French person of Arab origin who is unemployed will tend to say that it is because he is an Arab. But this is not true. Arabs have no specific problem." Blandine Kriegel, recently appointed as president of the High Council for Integration, declared, quote, "One would like integration to result from valorizing success rather than sympathize with the victim. The anti-racist and anti-discrimination lament is sometimes unbearable." Ironically, when I presented the results of the first study on discrimination in access to health care that had been funded by the government, the officials attending the meeting contested the findings and rejected the evidence of the investigation they had, however, solicited and financed, affirming that there was no discrimination in the French health care system. At the same time, in the interviews I conducted, a public prosecutor, referring to the problems experienced in hospitals, affirmed that, quote, "Instead of pointing out discrimination, one should insist on the good reception of all patients in general." A police official in charge of collecting complaints on that matter explained that, quote, "During a dispute, a woman called her neighbor filthy Arab, but it was a mere disagreement between neighbors, and the complaint, though, was not filed." And the public administrator, head of the Regional Committee for Equality, insisted that, quote, "Most of the time, employers are not really racist, but they have to discriminate because if they did not, they would lose their customers." In other words, the very persons who are supposed to combat racial discrimination nationally or locally did not seem to believe in its reality or its importance. Actually, the first national survey on that matter seemed to confirm, in the early 2000s, to confirm their doubts. Contrary to the method usually used elsewhere in Europe, asking directly the individuals about their experience of racial discrimination, the French researchers in charge of the investigation claimed a more constructivist questionnaire, not presuming the notion and therefore not using the words. The filter question was, "Were you ever mocked, rejected, or deprived of a right because of," and followed a list of 16 items, including age, name, sex, health, clothing and appearance, weight and height, way of speaking, color of skin, etc. Remarkably, the sample was representative of the whole population, leading white people being asked whether they had been mocked, rejected, or deprived of a right because of the color of their skin. The main findings were thus that the weight and height were the first cause of unfavorable treatment, while skin color was ranking 10th. As for the overall population, of course. As for the other potential markers of racial difference, it was impossible to know whether one was mocked because of a name from Africa or from Brittany, rejected because of an accent from Algiers or Marseille, deprived of the right because of an Islamic veil or of the wearing of pants. In the end, the authors of the survey could logically conclude that racial discrimination was much less frequent in France than usually assumed. How to account for this evolution in the past 2 decades? As the complete ignorance of racial discrimination until the 1990s, a similar meaning as the discrepancy between an official recognition of the problem and its practical neglect in the early 2000s. Can we use the same word, denial, with its polemical corollary, denialism, indistinctly to describe the two attitudes? To answer this question, I will turn to Freud's theory. By using a psychoanalytical lexicon and even psychoanalytical concepts to interpret social facts, I do not want to dramatically plead for an epistemic rupture with the Durkheimian rule, which prescribes the explanation of social facts by other social facts. More modestly, I want to refer to the psychoanalytic vocabulary and theory to establish a clear distinction between two rhetorics and two logics, which are often confused. All his life, Freud has attempted to explore the multiple forms of ambivalence and contradiction in our mental relation to the world. Two mechanisms have particularly retained his attention: Verleugnung, often translated as disavowal, and Verneinung, generally rendered by negation. Both refer to the psychic defenses developed to deal with traumatic perceptions. Verleugnung is relatively late in Freud's theory. It serves to interpret the attitude of the young boy who refuses to recognize the absence of a penis in a little girl, and more generally the mental act that consists in rejecting a perception as inconceivable. The reality it refers to is thus disavowed. This disavowal, which is characteristic of the phallic stage, is, quote, neither rare nor very dangerous for the mental life of the child, but in the adults, it could lead to psychosis, unquote. Indeed, in the Wolfman case history, the analysan mentions a dream that terrified him as a child. White wolves were sitting on a tree in front of his bedroom window, threatening to eat him up. For Freud, this dream was the consequence of the young boy having witnessed the primal scene of his parents having sex at ergo, a form of copulation which he later saw being done by animals. Thus, what Freud qualified as infantile neurosis, but appeared to be a severe psychosis later in the man's life, was due, according to him, to the disavowal of an unimaginable reality, the bestiality of his parents in the sexual scene. This disavowal does not imply the abolition of the representation, but of its signification. It does not make sense. The concept of Verleugnung, with which the psychoanalysts Jean Laplanche and Jean-Bertrand Pontalis translate as denial of reality, was further developed in an interesting way by the French psychologist Octave Manoni in a text titled I Know Very Well, But All the Same. He uses Don Taylesva's famous narrative, Sun Chief, the autobiography of a Hopi Indian. Among the Hopi, masks play a crucial role. Called kachinas, they come at a certain time of the year and frighten the children, who give them meat to appease them and receive in exchange corn balls. During the ceremonies of initiation, fathers and uncles reveal the adolescents that they were themselves behind the masks, causing a profound disillusion since the youth suddenly realize that authority is mystification. Yet, the belief is saved because the adults tell them that while they were acting as masks, the kachinas were actually present but invisible. So the initiated Hopi can now say, I know very well that the kachinas are my fathers or uncles, but at the same time, I know that, but all the same, the kachinas are there when my fathers and uncles dance with the masks on. The painful revelation is thus disavowed and the symbolic order comforted. No one will contest anymore the existence of the kachina. It is not difficult to see how the same mechanism was at work in France for decades to avoid the recognition of racial discrimination. In the country of human rights, where the national motto, liberty, equality, fraternity, is proudly inscribed on the pediment of all the city halls, and where the Republican ideology promotes civic virtue and the common good, both the existence of discrimination and its source in racial bias were inconceivable. As is clearly expressed in the first report of the High Council for Integration, the official discourse can be formulated in the following way. I know very well that there are differences of treatment according to the origin of the persons, but all the same, they are not discrimination, and besides, they are not racial. The uncomfortable and perhaps traumatic idea that the principle of equality was not respected, and moreover, that this failure concerned archaic prejudices about biological disparities between humans, was unthinkable and therefore disavowed. A parallel could be drawn here with a belief in the American dream perpetrated among US citizens and leaders in spite of the statistical evidence of an intergenerational mobility consistently lower than in Europe. The phrase could be here, I know very well that children born in poor African American families have a very high probability to become poor African Americans, and that the gap with the children born in wealthy white families has been increasing over recent years. But all the same, America is the land of opportunity, and anyone who tries hard can succeed and even become president of the United States. Like the mystification of the Cachinas, that of French egalitarianism or of the American dream, even when it is unveiled, is a too traumatic revelation to be accepted, it is denied. Verneinung, the other concept, appears early in Freud's work, but is definitively consolidated in his late writings. It is a psychic process by which a thought that is intolerable is rejected at the very moment it is formulated. It often takes the form of a negative formulation revealing the truth that is negated. Thus, the subject mentioning a dream including a woman says, that's Freud's example, you wonder who she is. It is not my mother. From what the analyst infers that it is precisely the mother. The general formulation associates rejection and projection. You may think that, but this is not true. For Freud, negation, I quote him, negation is a way of taking cognizance of what is repressed. The notion is mentioned for the first time in the Rat Man case study, which is the interpretation of an obsessional neurosis. Having heard by a fellow officer the story of a torture consisting in having rats eating their way into the anus of the victim, the man had the compulsion to imagine this ordeal inflicted to his father, whose memory he revered. He explicitly denied that this could have meant that he wished his father dead. Yet it later appeared that when his father was still alive, the man had the fantasy to see him die in order to inherit his fortune and be able to marry his fiancée. According to Freud, the no reveals what has become conscious but is dismissed. Negation thus preserves the representation and its signification, but the discomfort they provoke leads to their rejection. It is not what you think. It is tempting to compare the concept of Verneinung with that of mauvaise foi, bad faith, in Jean-Paul Sartre's theory. As it is developed in Being and Nothingness, bad faith corresponds to the fact that an individual under pressure from social forces disowns his or her freedom to act authentically. Through the mundane examples of the waiter who ostentatiously overplays his role and of the young woman on a first date who pretends not to understand the sexual intention of her companion, the French philosopher wants to underline the following paradox. When they act in bad faith, individuals are aware and unaware that they are free. It is a form of self-deception by which they are not entirely taken in. They pretend and know they pretend. The concept of bad faith that supposes the primacy of the consciousness at the expenses of a hypothetical unconscious. It implies that the individuals are overplaying or pretending, in other words, that they are not sincere, which is always problematic to establish. Besides, it underrates the traumatic dimension of reality, which is precisely why certain facts are more susceptible than others to be denied. Negation, therefore, seems more appropriate to interpret the situation prevailing from the early 2000s regarding racial discrimination in France. It is not possible anymore to ignore the fact, for the circumstantial and structural reason that I evoked earlier. The European Union, non-governmental organizations, social scientists, victims converge in demanding public action against racial discrimination. Yet, at the same time as the government develops new legislations, creates new structures, initiates new programs, the very persons who are supposed to implement these policies merely negate or most subtly diminish or shift the problem. You may think that racial discrimination is common in France, but it is not true. One could similarly think of some Republicans' obsessive aggressiveness toward President Obama. You may think it is racist, but it is not. And then an empty chair similar to the one that served as fake interlocutor to Clint Eastwood during the Republican convention is found hanging from a tree in Texas. Negation can take various rhetorical expressions, of which I have provided examples through a quotation of a series of French officials a little earlier. It can be a complete dismissal. There's no discrimination. It can be a minimization. Discrimination exists, but it's a marginal phenomenon limited to certain deviant people. It can be rationalization. Discrimination is comprehensible because those who practice it have to do so to protect their interest as employers or owners. It can be a disqualification. Discrimination is exaggerated by victims who complacently wallow in their condition of victimhood, taking advantage of a context receptive to their lament. Finally, it can be inversion. It is those complaining that they are discriminated who are actually discriminating, a discourse which is exemplified by the accusations of anti-white racism. All these forms of negation have in common to recognize what they simultaneously deny. In France, the rejection of the reality confirms not only its existence, but also its problematic character. It is not possible to see things the way they are because it would disrupt the fragile ideological equilibrium of the Republic. And it is precisely this fragile equilibrium that was disrupted by the riots of the fall of 2005. Analyzing ex post the events which had led to the first state of emergency since the Algerian War in France, the president, Jacques Chirac, explained the disturbances by what he called the poison of racial discrimination, acknowledging at last this painful reality. Denial has been so far considered from the perspective of a truth that is dismissed and of agents who are deceiving themselves and others, at least in part unconsciously. The implicit reasoning has been there is racial discrimination in France, and it has been denied for decades, whether it was ignored via a mechanism of disavowal or rejected through a process of negation. But is it so simple? Can we be so sure that what is called racial discrimination is really that? The question may seem absurd or rhetorical, yet it is at the heart of the debate about racial discrimination in law enforcement in France and beyond. Expressed simply, the problem can be summarized in the following way. According to a report of the European Union, France ranks second after the Netherlands among the 27 member states for the proportion of the population who declare that racial discrimination is very or fairly widespread in their country. 79% of the French share this view. And according to a national poll this time, when asked about the circumstances in which people experience such discrimination, the French indicate the interaction with the police in the first place. 67% see it as the institution most often involved. These figures are even higher for those in the sample who belong to ethnic minorities. Recently, a survey was conducted to analyze more specifically the relationship of the public with law enforcement agents. It shows that at a national level, 39% considered them to be racist, and 46% think they treat people of foreign origin worse than the rest of the population, while in the disadvantaged department of Seine-Saint-Denis, they are respectively even 42% and 51%. In other words, the French are more inclined to see racial discrimination as prevalent than other Europeans, and they attribute this phenomenon to the police in the first place, these opinions being even more strongly asserted when they belong to ethnic minorities. Up to this point, the findings should hardly be surprising. And learning that law enforcement agents have an opposite view on the subject will not seem extraordinary either. In the informal exchanges I had with them during the 15 months of my fieldwork, the topic of racism and discrimination often came in the discussion. The officers vigorously rejected the idea that they would be more racist than the average French people. Quote, "There might even be less racism here than elsewhere." To prove their good faith, they would mention that their wife was of immigrant origin, or that they had friends of color, or simply that they were there to enforce the law, whatever the origin or color of their public. Certainly, they arrested more Arabs and blacks, but the reason was simple: they committed more crime. Of course, they recognized the existence of some black sheep among them, whose conduct they disapprove. They were the exception, though. It was and it was often delinquents who pretended they were victims of police discrimination. Besides, they considered that more and more often they were themselves the target of racist insults from inhabitants. Dismissal, rationalization, minimization, disqualification, inversion, we have the full range of the rhetoric that I was analyzing before. So, nothing unexpected until now. More remarkable, however, is the position of the sociologists, criminologists, and political scientists. Contrarily to what one would have thought, insofar as since William Wesley's pioneering study in 1950, racism is generally represented as banal in the police and discrimination is viewed as common practice, there has been an intense debate, in particular in the United States and Britain, on this issue. It started almost 50 years ago with the inquiry conducted by Donald Black in 3 US cities, where he focused on the circumstances of arrests. On the whole, he established that for similar crimes, African Americans were more often arrested than whites, which suggested the existence of racial discrimination. But when the attitude of the suspect was taken into account, there were no more differences, since deferent and polite African Americans were as much at risk of being arrested as whites, behaving in the same way. The disparity of treatment by the police was, in fact, that's his argument, due to a conduct judged to be more aggressive among blacks. There was thus no racial discrimination in the arrests. Since this study, much research has been produced on the topic, providing contrasted results. Whereas almost all investigations establish that minorities are overrepresented among those stopped and frisked, questioned and charged, the role of racism and the evidence of discrimination are often discussed in relation to various, what they call, confounding variables. For instance, David Bailey and Harold Mendelsohn demonstrated in a study conducted in Denver that officers expressing racist prejudices did not treat African Americans and Hispanics harsher than the rest of their colleagues, but that all of them pragmatically considered, regardless of the ideology, that this population necessitated more often than others the use of physical force. Recently, Joel Miller concluded from an investigation carried out in London that the excess of stops and frisks of men belonging to ethnic minorities was simply due to their more frequent presence in the public spaces, what the author designated as their higher availability. In sum, Social scientists argue, on the basis of their statistical analysis, that not all differentiation is discrimination, that not all discrimination is racial, that racial discrimination is not necessarily the product of a racist intent, and that racist prejudices do not automatically lead to practices of racial discrimination. Should we infer that research refutes the experience of African Americans in the United States or of ethnic minorities in Europe, that racial profiling in stops and frisk is no more established than the suspicion of driving while black? In France, social scientists studying the police have followed the general trend described for the French society earlier. Until the late 90s, with the exception of one early study by René Lévy, they have shrugged off racism and discrimination. In the early 2000s, a few of them timidly began to study them, but the inaugural publication on the subject, a contribution by Fabien Jobard to a collective volume that I co-edited on the emerging racial question in France, was entirely devoted to the demonstration that there was no racial discrimination in law enforcement. Officers checked, searched, questioned, and arrested young Arabs and blacks more often than white youth because they were more often known to the police and had a higher probability of living in housing projects. Two reasons which made them the usual suspects. Thus, discrimination was determined by penal and territorial instead of racial considerations. In 2007, however, these two sociologists were chosen by George Soros Open Society to conduct the first quantitative survey on stops and frisks in France, using a method developed in the United States. Based on an observation of train and metro station in Paris, it showed that blacks and Arabs were respectively 6 and 8 times more likely to be checked and searched than whites. Ironically, the researcher who had denied the racial dimension of discrimination in his previous writing ended up being the one who established it. Yet, he was not entirely convinced that it was the color of the skin rather than the wearing of a hoodie that was responsible of the difference between the groups. The doubts raised by social scientists about the evidence of racial discrimination suggest that their denial may have to do not only with psychological processes, as we've seen before, but also with cognitive issues involving the way to apprehend the reality of the phenomenon. It is not only that they reject a reality they find uncomfortable, but also that the reality is more complex than what they are able to grasp with their instruments. Of course, one should not overlook the fact that ideological and institutional factors may contribute to their refutation of what people belonging to ethnic minorities experience on a usual, almost daily basis. Many social scientists studying the police share some of their values and views, or develop sympathy toward the difficulty of their profession and the hostile way they regard their public, or need to maintain good relations with them to be able to continue their research, all elements that may facilitate disavowal or negation of racial discrimination. Yet, there are probably also theoretical and methodological reasons for their contesting the existence of its reality. Let us consider, for example, two facts generally assumed. One, that the police patrol mostly in housing projects because criminality is higher, and two, stop more people belonging to minorities because they are more prone to deviant behaviors. These are two strong arguments against the existence of racial discrimination in law enforcement, or at least against what the British anthropologist Michael Bunton calls categorical discrimination based on ascription and prejudice, as opposed to statistical discrimination based on the probability of efficacy. I will limit my discussion to France and focus on my own research outside of Paris. So firstly, housing projects do not have more preoccupying crime levels than the rest of the conurbation where they are situated, contrary to what is usually assumed. Property crimes are in fact significantly lower, and violent crimes are only higher because of the frequency of the offense of insulting and resisting the public forces. Now, the problem of these offenses is that they are a marker not so much of the attitude of the residents of these neighborhoods as of the conduct of the police when they get there. It appears from the interviews I conducted and the discussion I had that all officers consider, and any commissioner knows, that the more insulting and resisting the public forces violations an agent produces, the more aggressive he is. And it has been established through an analysis of legal cases concerning these offenses that blacks and Arabs are largely overrepresented among these violators. In other words, the police do not stop and arrest more people living in the housing project because crime is more prevalent there, but their harassment of certain social and ethnic categories contribute to the excess of specific offenses via a peculiar form of what the Canadian philosopher Ian Hacking calls a looping effect. Secondly, the higher rate of delinquency among minorities has many causes, one of them being that they have more chance of being caught. This has long been established by the interactionist sociology and is particularly obvious in the case of drug use. Smoking marijuana or carrying a quantity corresponding to one's personal consumption is illegal in France. Yet, surveys show that approximately 1/5 of the youth declare using marijuana on a regular basis, regardless of their social milieu. In my observations, I noticed that when students of an expensive business school were having parties downtown, ostentatiously drinking alcohol and smoking marijuana outside of bars, the police would monitor the area without intervening. At some point, they would leave and go to housing projects where they practiced stops and frisk of the youth hanging around, often arresting those in possession of a small quantity of cannabis. It took me a while to understand that the police was not only tolerating the deviant behavior of the upper-class youngsters, but protecting them from those residing in the disadvantaged neighborhoods who they thought could have taken advantage of the situation to abuse and rob them. In other words, law enforcement agents did not stop and arrest Arab and black youth because they were more delinquent, but because they considered them to be what the Australian criminologist John Allen Lee analyzes as police property. A last illustration might be useful. In the essay on racial discrimination in law enforcement, in which the author that I already mentioned argued that there was no racial discrimination in law enforcement, one case seems particularly telling. On a country road, officers decide to stop a vehicle described as, quote, entering a dirt track alongside the railroad, an indication that the occupants might be gypsies getting up to something that merited police attention, unquote. And this decision was interpreted by the author as discrimination based on behavior and not racial. Considering that Roma people usually live in camps in the countryside, which they can only access via dirt roads, to suspect them of misdeed when they do so suggests their automatic association with delinquency, which is difficult not to qualify as prejudice. Actually, in my own research, the police would make derogatory comments such as, with the Jeepos, there's so much crime, the men steal gas out of the trucks, the women pickpockets in the subway, or, we'll never get rid of them, Romanians just breed, they're everywhere. These were not just words. The remarks translated into acts. One night, we were driving along a country road when in front of us a car signaled and entered onto a dirt track again. Jeepos, announced one of the officers, mentally assessing both the state of the vehicle and the proximity of a traveler camp. He hesitated a few seconds and added, let's check them. Flasher on, car stopped, the officer surrounded it. Inside was a family, a man of about 40, his wife and their children. Checks on their identity and car documents began. Meanwhile, the father was subjected to a hostile interrogation. He replied humbly, almost apologetically. Have you been here long? We've arrived two days ago. How long are you staying? We don't know yet, but probably a while because my mom is seriously ill. She's got cancer and she's in hospital. Always the same stories. The officer did not imagine the explanation could be true. But even if it was, it would only reinforce his conviction, which he had earlier expressed, that these people were parasites who burden the country. After asking where the man worked, to which he answered that he did not have a job, the officer continued, this time in a tone of anger tinged with sarcasm, while the man was finding it difficult to hide his irritation. And why aren't you looking for work? Do you think it's easy for us to find a job? So do what everyone else does, sign up with the National Employment Agency. And you think the employment agency will find us work? Well, you certainly got enough dough anyway. You all drive Porsche Cayennes. But we haven't got cars like that. Look at ours. And indeed, it was an old Renault, the pitiful state of which underlined the impoverished appearance of the family's clothing. But it required more than this to overturn the common belief that Roma were secretly wealthy. The often told story of a family who settled and built themselves a grand house and owned a luxury SUV had become a sort of myth that circulated in the precinct and had come to represent the Roma as a whole. Even when it was belied by evidence of the deplorable living conditions of most of those stopped on the road or visited in their camps, it fueled suspicion and resentment toward the group and individuals belonging to it. The exchange between the officer and the driver continued in this vein until the car and its occupant were allowed to leave, since everything was fully in order. As with other checks on Roma that I would witness, no offense had been identified. But although they were not able to press any charge, the officers who had taken part in this humiliating routine consoled themselves with the thought that, at least, they had given these undesirable nomads a bad time. Describing at some length the scene, I want to stress the fact that statistical studies of racial discrimination in law enforcement are not sufficient to apprehend the phenomenon. The problem for those who are stopped and frisked is not only quantitative, the frequency of such checks, but also qualitative, the way in which they are treated, the contempt, the mocking, the bullying. Observation is indispensable to apprehend this dimension, since officers never admit it in interviews and victims exceptionally file complaints about it. And this observation must be long enough for the agents to forget more or less the presence of the researcher. The fact that no ethnography had ever been carried out in France had prevented from accounting for this reality. The cognitive obstacles to the apprehension of racial discrimination by the police thus implies theoretical as well as methodological issues. More precisely, to overcome them, critical thinking and ethnographical work are indispensable. Critical thinking unveils that the argument of an excess of crime in housing projects and among minority youth has not necessarily empirical grounds, that the omnipresence of the police in the disadvantaged neighborhoods contributes to producing its justification, that discrimination is not only a question of quantity, but also of quality. Ethnographical work reveals that racist prejudices get along better with racial discrimination than criminologists usually assume, that the deviance of the upper-class students is treated with significantly more indulgence than that of the youth of the housing projects, that some officers practice a systematic harassment of certain ethnic groups. It is the combination of critique and ethnography that renders visible racial discrimination, which a more positivist approach and an exclusively statistical procedure tend to make invisible. The task I have undertaken here is somewhat parallel to that accomplished by my late colleague Albert Hirschman when he engaged in his famous study of the rhetoric of reaction. In both cases, the intention is to enlighten a phenomenon that can be expressed in generic terms, how to account for the fact that some seem to see the world with different eyes compared to others. Instead of condemning those who systematically criticize the progressive agenda, in his case, or denouncing those who unflinchingly deny the existence of racial discrimination in mine, one needs to apprehend better these divergences and to eliminate the blind spots of the visions that underlie them. In his study, Albert Hirschman decided, quote, to attempt a cool examination of the surface phenomena, discourse, arguments, rhetoric, with the idea that he could show that reaction was governed, he said, simply by the imperatives of argument. I have taken a symmetrical path, trying to explore depth phenomena, both psychological and cognitive, in an endeavor that could be situated in the lineage of Gaston Bachelard's essay, The Formation of the Scientific Mind, subtitled A Contribution to a Psychoanalysis of Objective Knowledge. I have analyzed what he calls epistemological obstacles. In the first part, as psychic phenomena, which I interpreted in terms of disavowal, I know very well but all the same, and negation, you may think that, but it's not true. And in the second one, as cognitive limits, which I suggested to confront through critical thinking to reduce positivist trends, and ethnographic work to complement statistical analysis. Reasoning in terms of epistemological obstacles avoids presuming a lack of sincerity of the agents. It is not impossible, of course, that they purposely deny a reality that they have an objective interest in overlooking. But it is more probable that they believe what they say, and in any case, it is heuristic to think that they do. But moving from the psychic to the cognitive, as I have done here, implies a shift from the idea that there is a reality which is rejected to the notion that reality itself depends on the intellectual instruments one mobilizes to apprehend it. In other words, from the idea of truth to the notion of complexity. But far from being a relativistic interpretation, which would subtly deny racial discrimination, it is a strategic move which I believe can contribute to understanding it more deeply, and which I hope can give weapons to those who combat it. Thank you.